Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The dust swirls across a sun-scorched plain as gunfire cracks in the distance. A steam locomotive barrels down the tracks. Wanted posters flap against the side of a saloon, bearing the stern-eyed face of a man who became the most famous outlaw of the American West. His name? Jesse James. From the smoky chaos of Old West shootouts to the bold headlines screaming of yet another daring robbery, Jesse James has long lived in the shadows between history and myth. To some, he was a cold-blooded murderer, a criminal who killed without hesitation, robbing banks and trains, leaving behind a trail of fear and bloodshed. To others, he was something different, a rebel, a symbol of defiance against corrupt bankers, railroad barons, and the post-war establishment. A man shaped by violence, but driven by a twisted sense of justice. But who was Jesse James, really? This isn't just a story about a man with a gun. It's a story about America during its most turbulent transformation. A country still reeling from civil war, fractured by politics, and fueled by rapid expansion. Jesse James rode through the middle of it all, shaped by war, violence, and legend. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of folklore and Hollywood glamour to uncover the truth. We'll explore his roots as a Confederate guerrilla, the motivations behind his crimes, and how newspapers and dime novels helped build the legend. We'll hear from historians, examine real documents, and dig into the conspiracy theories that followed him even in death. So now we ask you, was Jesse James just another outlaw chasing fortune with a gun? Or was he something more, a folk? Hero forged by the times he lived in, this is the story of Jesse James, outlaw or American hero. Jesse James was born in 1847 in Clay County, Missouri, a border state torn between North and South. His family owned slaves, and their loyalties leaned heavily toward the Confederacy. Missouri wasn't just a battleground of armies, it was a battleground of neighbors. The violence wasn't clean or organized, it was personal, brutal, and often driven by revenge rather than military strategy. And it was in this environment, steeped in tension and bloodshed, that Jesse James came of age. When the Civil War broke out, Jesse was still a teenager, but his older brother Frank had already joined the Confederate cause. Eventually, Jesse followed. In his footsteps, not into the regular Confederate army, but into the shadows of guerrilla warfare. Alongside notorious figures like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, Jesse and Frank rode as part of a group known as bushwhackers. These men weren't bound by the rules of conventional warfare. They ambushed Union patrols, burned homes, and slaughtered suspected sympathizers. One of the most infamous acts Jesse likely took part in was the Centralia Massacre, where more than 20 unarmed Union soldiers were executed and mutilated. It wasn't just war. It was savagery fueled by political hatred and personal vengeance. This experience left a deep mark on Jesse. The war taught him how to kill, how to survive, and, perhaps most importantly, how to see himself as a soldier in a cause that didn't end with surrender. When the war was over in 1865 and the Confederacy had fallen, Jesse and Frank didn't lay down their arms. They saw the Union victory not as peace, but as occupation. For many ex-Confederates, the war had merely shifted from open battlefields to subtler, more personal forms of rebellion. In the chaotic, lawless aftermath of the Civil War, Jesse James didn't just fade into obscurity. He and his brother reemerged as something new, outlaws, but ones who painted their crimes with political justification. They robbed banks and trains that they claimed were symbols of federal tyranny or northern greed. And in the minds of many, former Confederates, especially in Missouri, these actions weren't just criminal, they were acts of resistance. Jesse's transformation from teenage guerrilla fighter to infamous outlaw didn't happen overnight. It was forged in the fires of a divided America, where loyalty, loss, and vengeance were far more powerful than any law on paper. His legend didn't begin with a robbery. It began on the battlefields of a nation at war with itself. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the American South, and particularly border states like Missouri, were left fractured, lawless, and full of lingering resentment. Reconstruction efforts aimed to reunite the country, but for many former Confederates, it felt more like punishment than healing. Federal troops patrolled southern towns, New laws disrupted traditional power structures, and northern businessmen, often labeled carpetbaggers, poured in to seize economic opportunity. Into this volatile mix stepped Jesse and Frank James, now war-hardened and deeply embittered. It was during this chaotic post-war period that Jesse and Frank joined forces with fellow ex-Confederate fighters, Cole and Jim Younger, to form the infamous James Younger Gang. These weren't your average drifters or thieves. These were men trained in guerrilla tactics, bonded by their war experience and fueled by a shared sense of betrayal. They saw the institutions of Reconstruction, the banks, the railroads, and even the federal government itself, as extensions of Northern control, ripe for retaliation. Their first confirmed bank robbery came in 1869 in Gallatin, Missouri, where Jesse reportedly shot and killed the cashier, believing he was a former Union officer. Over the next decade, the gang would go on a spree of violence and theft, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches across Missouri, Kentucky, Minnesota, and beyond. Each target was carefully chosen, often businesses with ties to Republican leaders, Union backers, or Northern investors. In Jesse's eyes, this wasn't just crime. It was a continuation of the war by other means. And yet, as their crimes escalated, so too did their legend. Fueled by sensational newspaper stories and the dime novel industry, the James Younger Gang was portrayed not just as outlaws, but as folk heroes. Writers like John Newman Edwards, a former Confederate officer himself, helped spin Jesse's image into that of a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing from the corrupt and powerful to give back to the common folk. But was that really true? There's little concrete evidence that Jesse and his gang shared their loot with the poor, at least not in the charitable sense. More often, they paid off informants, safe housekeepers, or used money to bribe local lawmen. Still, in many Southern communities, especially those ravaged by the war and bitter about the loss, Jesse James became a kind of anti-hero. He was seen as someone who hadn't surrendered, someone who still fought back. The Robin Hood myth wasn't born from fact. It was born from desperation. In an era where many felt powerless, Jesse James offered a symbol of resistance. Whether or not he truly helped the downtrodden didn't matter. What mattered was that he appeared to stand against the same forces that had humiliated the South. By the mid-1870s, the James Younger Gang had become the most feared and most celebrated outlaws in America. Their boldness, the public fascination, and their deep ties to Confederate loyalty made them more than criminals. They were living symbols of a country that had never fully healed from its greatest war. The legend of Jesse James wasn't just built on bullets and banknotes. It was meticulously crafted through the power of the press. And at the center of this myth-making machine was John Newman Edwards, a Confederate veteran turned newspaper editor who saw in Jesse James not just a criminal, but a cause. Edwards, who founded the St. Louis Dispatch and later edited the Kansas City Times, was fiercely loyal to the Confederate cause and deeply resentful of Reconstruction. He believed that the South had been humiliated and oppressed by Northern victors, and he used his pen as a weapon to fight back. Jesse James, a former guerrilla fighter still waging war on Reconstruction-era symbols of power, became the perfect avatar for Edwards' crusade. Through editorials, letters, and stories, many written with Jesse's direct input, Edwards painted a portrait of the outlaw not as a thief or killer, but as a defiant rebel resisting the injustice of post-war America. In Edwards' hands, Jesse James became a Southern Robin Hood, a man who robbed trains owned by greedy, corrupt railroad tycoons and banks that had foreclosed on struggling farmers. He was portrayed as someone fighting not for personal gain, but for the people, for the South, for justice. This version of Jesse James was careful, even noble, never hurting the innocent, always targeting the oppressors. And it worked. Public perception began to shift. Jesse was no longer just an outlaw. He was a folk hero. The media, hungry for sensational stories and scandalous headlines, ran with it. Newspapers across the country picked up and reprinted Edwards' accounts. Stories of daring daylight robberies, dramatic shootouts, and narrow escapes captured the imagination of readers. But with each retelling, the line between truth and legend grew blurrier. Jesse's crimes were real, violent, often deadly. But the narrative built around him was carefully curated. Victims were left out or minimized. Brutalities were softened. Motives were rewritten to fit a larger, more romantic cause. This manipulation was effective. Jesse's popularity soared not just in Missouri, but throughout the South. In a time when many felt voiceless and defeated, he represented something larger than life. The idea that one man could still defy the system. Edwards even published letters allegedly written by Jesse himself, criticizing the government, attacking carpetbaggers, and defending his actions as just retaliation. Whether Jesse actually wrote these or merely approved them, the effect was the same. It kept his image alive and politically charged. But beneath the carefully polished myth was still a man responsible for real violence, for innocent lives lost in the chaos of his robberies. The press rarely covered the grief of widows, the trauma of witnesses, or the fear Jesse's name inspired in communities. In shaping Jesse's legacy, Edwards and the media didn't just distort facts. They helped enshrine a dangerous kind of heroism, one rooted in vengeance rather than justice. By the time Jesse James reached the peak of his infamy, he was no longer just an outlaw. He was a cultural icon. His face appeared on wanted posters and dime novels. His exploits became legend, his motives romanticized. And all of it was possible because of one fundamental truth. The story people wanted to believe was more powerful than the truth itself. As the legend of Jesse James grew, so did the body count, and the line between righteous rebellion and ruthless violence began to blur. The crimes Jesse committed weren't just bold, they were brutal. While newspapers often glamorized his exploits, the reality was far more complex and at times deeply disturbing. One of the first major acts that catapulted Jesse and his gang into infamy was the robbery of the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, in 1866. Widely considered the first daylight bank robbery in American history, it marked a dramatic shift in criminal activity, bold, theatrical, and dangerous. The gang got away with over $60,000, a staggering sum for the time. But what most press accounts failed to emphasize was the collateral damage. A young bystander, a college student named George Jolly Wymore, was shot and killed during the escape. He was unarmed, uninvolved, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It set a grim precedent. Jesse's operations weren't surgical strikes. They were storms of violence where innocent lives could and did get caught in the crossfire. As the gang expanded their operations to train robberies, they continued to up the ante. These heists, like the 1873 Rock Island train robbery in Adair, Iowa, weren't just about money. They were psychological warfare. The gang derailed the train by removing a section of track, killing the engineer instantly and injuring several passengers. They looted safes, robbed passengers at gunpoint, and disappeared into the night. For the James Younger gang, it was about sending a message. No institution, no authority, be it railroad or federal government, was safe. But not every act could be justified as part of some grand cause. Jesse's willingness to use violence, often preemptively, suggests a man who had grown hardened and paranoid. He frequently killed informants or anyone suspected of betrayal. Witnesses were silenced. Fear kept people quiet, and loyalty was enforced, with the threat of death. One example came in 1874, when Pinkerton detectives tracked the gang to the James family farm. In the resulting confrontation, Jesse's young half-brother was killed, and his mother lost her arm to a bomb thrown by agents. While this tragedy turned public sentiment temporarily in Jesse's favor, it also underscored how dangerous his life had become, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Some killings, like those during failed bank robberies or mistaken identities during frantic getaways, raise the question, were these truly strategic? Or were they senseless, acts of rage and desperation from a man spiraling deeper into lawlessness? Jesse liked to frame his violence as a necessary evil in the fight against injustice, but time and again, the blood spilled bore no relation to politics. It was about power, control, and survival. Jesse James was not a surgical revolutionary. He was a man who'd learned to justify violence as a means to an end, even when the victims were innocent. And that distinction matters, because it forces us to look beyond the legend and confront the reality of what he truly was. Unlike freedom fighters or organized revolutionaries who use violence with precision and political strategy, Jesse's methods were unpredictable and often indiscriminate. He wasn't targeting oppressive regimes with carefully planned strikes. He was ambushing trains, robbing banks, and firing into crowds where civilians could be, and often were, caught in the crossfire. And this wasn't just occasional collateral damage. Violence, chaos, and fear were built into the very fabric of how Jesse operated. To Jesse, his actions were justified through a lens shaped by war, trauma, and vengeance. He saw himself as a rebel still fighting the Civil War, a war that never ended for him or others like him. He believed he was striking back at the victors of that war, the federal government, the banks, and the railroads that symbolized Northern power and Reconstruction. But the reality is that in pursuing this vendetta, he used tools that inflicted suffering far beyond those institutions. Take, for example, the bank robberies that often resulted in the deaths of clerks, bystanders, and lawmen. These weren't accidents. They were a consistent part of how the James gang did business. If someone resisted, they were shot. If someone looked like they might raise an alarm, they were eliminated. The idea of proportional force or moral boundaries didn't seem to apply. Jesse saw enemies everywhere, and paranoia drove him to preemptively strike down anyone he suspected of betrayal, sometimes with little or no proof. To him, it was better to kill a potential threat than to leave a risk alive. In towns where Jesse struck, the aftermath wasn't romantic or heroic. It was tragic. Families were left mourning husbands, sons, and brothers who just happened to be in the wrong place. Entire communities lived in fear, knowing that they could be next, not because they were powerful oppressors, but simply because their local bank held payroll or their railroad station served as a target. This is why the myth of Jesse James as a Southern Robin Hood starts to fall apart under scrutiny. A true folk hero lifts up the oppressed. Jesse, on the other hand, left behind broken lives, often among the very people he claimed to represent. There's no evidence he systematically redistributed wealth to the poor. There's plenty of evidence that he kept it for himself and his gang. So when we say that the divide between myth and man becomes painfully clear, we're pointing to that deep contradiction. The man who was elevated by newspapers and folklore as a defiant symbol of rebellion was, in practice, someone who used the chaos of the post-war world to justify a reign of fear and bloodshed. The guns he wielded weren't aimed only at the powerful. They killed indiscriminately. And in the wake of each robbery or ambush, what remained wasn't legend. It was trauma, buried in the memories of towns too small to make the headlines. In the end, Jesse James wasn't just a byproduct of war. He became a war unto himself, one that blurred all lines between justice, vengeance, and cruelty. By the early 1880s, Jesse James was a man on the run, not just from the law, but from time itself. His gang had been dismantled, his old allies were dead or imprisoned, and his once loyal circle had shrunk to a few desperate, untrustworthy men. Years of living outside the law, always looking over his shoulder, had taken a toll. He moved constantly, used aliases like Mr. Howard, and trusted almost no one. But even among those few he did trust, betrayal was brewing. That betrayal came from Robert Ford, a young gang member who idolized Jesse but also saw an opportunity. Ford, along with his brother Charlie, had been brought into Jesse's confidence during one of his most isolated periods. Jesse, paranoid and reclusive, still needed help to plan robberies. But the Ford brothers had been quietly in contact with Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden, who had placed a $10,000 bounty on Jesse's head. The offer was clear: bring in Jesse James, dead or alive. On April 3, 1882, in St. Joseph, Missouri, Jesse James woke up in the rented house he shared with the Fords. After breakfast, he noticed a dusty picture on the wall and stood on a chair to straighten it, an oddly mundane, almost cinematic detail for what came next. In that moment, with Jesse's back turned, Robert Ford pulled out a revolver and shot him in the back of the head. It was a shocking act. Jesse James, the notorious outlaw who had eluded capture for over a decade, was killed not in a shootout or a daring standoff, but by someone he trusted in his own home, with no warning. The public was stunned. Some saw Ford as a hero, others viewed him as a coward. That moment gave rise to the infamous line, "The dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard," a lyric from a popular folk ballad that echoed across the country. But Jesse's story didn't end with his death. It only grew larger. Almost instantly, he was mythologized. Newspapers ran lurid headlines. dime novels painted him as a misunderstood rebel, a victim of betrayal, and a hero of the South. His grave became a pilgrimage site. Some refused to believe he was really dead, spawning rumors and conspiracy theories that Jesse James had faked his death and lived out his days under a new identity. Robert Ford, for all his infamy, never found peace. He and his brother tried to profit from their role in Jesse's death by reenacting the murder on stage, but the public backlash was fierce. Ford was booed, heckled, even physically attacked. Many saw what he did as treacherous, not brave. In 1892, 10 years after killing Jesse James, Robert Ford himself was shot and killed in a saloon by a man with his own grudge. Jesse James, meanwhile, was no longer just a man. He was legend. His life, death, and betrayal were retold in books, ballads, and films for generations. And like all enduring myths, the truth was blurred with every retelling, leaving behind a symbol more powerful than the man himself. In the end, it was not the bullet that immortalized Jesse. It was the betrayal. Jesse James's legacy is as divided as the nation he lived in. For some, he remains a symbol of rebellion, a folk hero who stood up to northern elites, corrupt banks, and railroad tycoons that were seen as pillaging the post-war South. For others, he was nothing more than a violent criminal who cloaked his actions in political justification while leaving a trail of death and fear behind. This tension between admiration and condemnation has made Jesse James one of America's most enduring and polarizing figures. The cultural memory of Jesse James didn't fade with time. It grew stronger. In the decades after his death, novels and stage plays turned him into a larger-than-life legend. Hollywood later took up the mantle, casting stars like Tyrone Power, Robert Wagner, and Brad Pitt in the role of Jesse. Each film shaped public perception differently. Some portrayed him as a tragic anti-hero, others as a cold-blooded killer. Country songs like The Ballad of Jesse James immortalized his tale in music, with lyrics that often focused on his charm and betrayal more than his crimes. But as historical research deepened and new perspectives emerged, the narrative began to shift. Historians started questioning the romanticized image. Was Jesse truly fighting injustice, or was he simply using Southern resentment as a cover for self-enrichment and personal vengeance? His targets weren't always the faceless arms of power. Banks he robbed weren't all corrupt. Bystanders and tellers, many of them working class, often paid with their lives. In this light, Jesse James begins to look less like a Robin Hood figure and more like a man who capitalized on chaos and myth. His image was crafted not just by his actions, but by media figures like John Newman Edwards, who were eager to paint him as a Southern icon. That media manipulation became part of his story, a reminder of how public opinion can be shaped and heroes can be manufactured, and yet the myth still endures. Jesse James remains a magnetic figure in the American psyche not because of what he did, but because of what he came to represent. His story isn't just about the man. It's about the idea of him. The swagger, the rebel charm, the frayed loyalty to his brother Frank, and the ultimate betrayal by Robert Ford. It all plays like a Shakespearean tragedy stitched into the fabric of American folklore. People are drawn to the complexity. A man shaped by war, hardened by loss, and seemingly standing against a changing world he no longer belonged to. His myth taps into something deeper than history. It touches the American hunger for justice, even if it comes from the barrel of a gun. Jesse's defiance of banks, railroads, and authority, whether real or embellished, feels like vengeance on behalf of the powerless. He gave people a story where the underdog fights back. In a post-civil war South bruised by defeat and occupation, Jesse became a vessel for regional pride and unresolved rage. He wasn't just robbing banks. In the eyes of some, he was robbing the North. The myth gave meaning to chaos, but it's also a cautionary tale. Strip away the poetry, and you're left with a man who used ideology as a shield for brutality. His robberies left towns terrified. He killed without hesitation, sometimes without reason. The people who died weren't all agents of oppression. Many were clerks, guards, farmers. The real Jesse James was neither hero nor martyr. He was a veteran of a cruel war who never laid down his weapons, who saw violence as a form of justice and never questioned his right to deliver it. That tension between outlaw justice and criminal violence is part of what makes his story timeless. It forces us to look at how legends are made, who decides what gets romanticized, who gets to be a rebel and who gets called a terrorist. Jesse James's myth flourished thanks to sympathetic journalists, dime novelists, and filmmakers who were willing to blur the line between history and heroism. In doing so, they built a narrative that has outlived truth. And maybe that's the most enduring part of Jesse James's legacy. He challenges us to confront the stories we tell ourselves about freedom, rebellion, and identity. He forces us to reckon with the fact that sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't just blurred, it's completely rewritten. In that way, Jesse James isn't just a relic of the Wild West. He's a mirror held up to the nation that created him. Jesse James remains one of the most polarizing figures in American history, a man whose legacy sits at the crossroads of myth and reality. On one hand, his actions speak clearly. He robbed banks and trains, killed men, and lived outside the law. Innocent people died during his heists, and there's little question that he used violence as a primary tool. Many historians argue that Jesse was not fighting for justice, but rather for his own gain, cloaking greed and brutality in the fading ideals of the Confederate cause. They see him as a product of a violent time, but ultimately just another outlaw fueled by ego, revenge, and the thrill of defiance. But others offer a more complicated view. To them, Jesse James was a symbol, a man who rose from the ashes of a shattered South and struck back at the institutions many Southerners saw as corrupt and oppressive. His targets were often connected to Northern banks, railroad companies, and Reconstruction-era politicians. Supporters saw him as a rebel with a cause, someone who dared to challenge the new order imposed after the Civil War. Newspapers in Missouri portrayed him as a folk hero, even when the blood on his hands suggested otherwise. His defenders argue that in a time when the lines between law and power were blurred, Jesse stood for resistance, however flawed. And then there's the myth itself, the legend carefully crafted by sympathetic journalists and dime novelists. Over time, it became difficult to tell where Jesse the man ended and Jesse the symbol began. Was he ever truly a Robin Hood figure? Did he fight for the poor, or simply use them to justify his crimes? That ambiguity is part of what keeps his story alive. So what's the truth? Maybe Jesse James was a little of both, a rebel shaped by war and injustice, but one who ultimately let violence define him. His legend says as much about America as it does about the man himself. Now it's your turn to decide. Was Jesse James a rebel with a cause, or just another outlaw? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the life, crimes, and legend of Jesse James. Now we want to hear from you. Was Jesse a symbol of Southern resistance and rebellion, or simply a dangerous outlaw who became a myth? Drop your verdict in the comments. Let's see where you stand in the great Jesse James debate. And if you thought this story was wild, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Up next in our Outlaw Legends series, The Real Billy the Kid, separating fact from fiction in the story of the West's most famous gunslinger. Make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this episode with anyone who loves untold history. Until next time, keep questioning the legends.